Morning to all. In today's session, you are going to learn the law of supply and the elasticity of supply analysis in detail. So let's begin with the concept of supply. So what is the definition? What is all about the supply means for? Supply refers to any quantity of a commodity by which a producer or a seller or a retailer are willing to produce and offer the products for sale at a particular price or at a different prices at a particular period of time in a given market. That's called supply. So supply, in simple terms, the supply refers to any quantities which a producer or seller willing to sell that particular products at different prices at a particular period or point of time in a given market. That's called supply. There are three important aspects of supply. The first one is the supply. It refers to a desired quantity which a seller or a producer or a wholesaler is offered for sale. Second aspect is the supply is always being explained or described in reference to price. Third aspect is that time. That whatever the sale offered to the customers or to the consumers during a particular period of time towards the products offered for sale. That's called the desired quantity, the reference to price, and the time period. These are the three main important aspects of supply where the supply has been defined for. The next one is supply schedule and supply curve. So, in reference to the supply, there is another more important concept before I begin to elasticities or the law of supply concept. Before that, you need to understand what is the supply schedule and the supply curve. Supply schedule refers to a tabular representation which shows or represent the different quantities of a product that a producer or a seller is willing to sell at different prices or a price level of that particular commodity. That's called the supply schedule. But when we talk about the supply curve in a very simple manner, it is a graphical representation of the supply curve shown. That's called the supply curve. So there are various categories when we talk about the supply curve or the another category that is market supply schedule or the market supply curve. So the difference between these two is when that before you apply the concept of the supply curve, you need to represent in a tabular form about the supply schedule, which shows different quantities in reference to a different price level towards a particular product, whether it be rice or it be wheat or any of the production of rice and wheat. That's called the supply schedule. So there are two main types of supply schedule and supply curve. That is the individual supply schedule and individual supply curve. And the second is market supply schedule and the market supply curve. So when we talk about the individual supply schedule, we are not talking about the suppliers. We are not talking about the individuals. We are not talking about the market. We are just talking about the individual or an individual person. That's called the individual supply schedule. So basically, individual supply schedule refers the different quantities of a product supplied by an individual or individual seller at different price level during a particular period of time towards that quantity, say rice and wheat. That's called the individual supply schedule. So on the basis of the individual supply schedule, a particular you can see a learner can easily drive the graphical representation of a supply curve. So you can see on the screen that the price of milk, that is per liter in rupees, has been given, that is 10, 12, 14, and 16, which is the particular, if we talk about the price of the milk is increasing by a difference of 2 rupees When we talk about the quantity supply, that is 1000 per day in liter, that is 10, 15, 20, and 25. So if we look at the individual supply curve, the price goes up increasing and the quantities also goes increasing. That means there is a positive relationship between the price and the quantity supplied. So on the basis of that, when it is a positive relationship, it automatically understand that the supply curve or the shape of the supply curve would be upward sloping. So you can see on the screen the graphical representation of individual supply curve that has been shown, that it refers to a positive relation or a positive functional relationship between the price and the quantity supplied of a particular commodity at different price level or quantities during a particular period of time, and that's called the individual supply curve, which is a graphical representation of the individual supply schedule. So when we talk about from the graphical representation, it refers that the supply curve it's upward sloping with representing a straight line which goes upward from left to right. It also implies that the supply of a particular commodity would get increased when there is an increment or when there is an increase in the price of a product. So this is a conceptual framework of the individual supply curve and the individual supply schedule. So let's talk about the next concept, that is the market supply schedule and the market supply curve. So when we talk about the market, we are not talking about individual person or an individual seller. We are talking about the individuals. We are talking about the producers. We are talking about the suppliers. We are talking about the sellers. And that stands for market. And that, if any market supply curve, it refers to different quantities of a product supplied by a suppliers or a producers or a sellers at different price level during a particular period of time in a given market. That's called the market supply schedule. So when we talk about the supply market supply curve, it is a graphical representation of the market supply curve which refers a different quantity supplied by a different producers, or you can say the suppliers at different price level in a particular given market during a particular period of time, and that's called the market supply curve. So this is a graphical representation, or in other words, I could say the conceptual framework of the market supply schedule and the market supply curve. So in a particular diagram, you could see the individual supply, that is of different suppliers, that is A, B, C. So when you combine the individual quantities supplied, and that becomes the market supply. So if you add on the individual supply or quantities of A, B, and C, so once you add on, then a new concept could drive, that is called the market supply. So it's 1700, 900, 50, 2300, 2600. So if we look at the price of products, that it goes on increasing, and as well as the individual supplies also goes on increasing, and ultimately if everything goes on increasing, definitely the supply concepts should already stated or represented that the price and quantity supply would get increased, so automatically the market supply would also get increased. So if you can see the graphical representation, it is a upward sloping, and while showing up the curves of individual supply curve where the prices as well as the quantities would get increased by different consumers, that is A, B, and C. So once you combine it, the market supply curve which goes on increasing, that shows in the upward sloping. So it represents a direct relationship between the quantity supplied and the price of a product To conclude the concept, it shows a functional positive relationship between the quantity supplied and the price of a product by a suppliers or a sellers or a producers. So that's called the market supply curve in the market supply schedule. So let's talk about the supply function, or I could say, in other words, that is the determinants of supply. That means there are various factors which ultimately influence and have a direct impact on the supply. So this is called the various parameters. I could say the various factors which direct influence the supply curve or a supply of a commodity. So, what before I come up to the factors, you need to understand what is the supply function. Supply functions study or represents the functional relationship between the supply of a commodity and its various determinants. So, if we talk about the supply quantity, or in other words, quantity supplied is a function of the supply of a commodity, price of a commodity, a price of a related goods, number of firms, technology, goal of the firm, price of the factors of production, expected future price, and government policy. So these are the determinants, these are the factors which influence the supply of a commodity, and that's called the supply function. So when we talk about the first factor or first determinant of the supply, that is supply of commodity, that means the supply would get any change when there is any change in the supply due to the change in its price itself. So when the price of a milk or a price of a wheat could get increased, their quantity supplied would also get increased, and that's called the supply function, or one of the factor which influence the supply or which influence a change in the supply. That's called, the next concept is the price of a commodity. So automatically it refers to a direct relationship, or in other words, I could say the positive relationship between the price and the quantity supplied of a commodity. So in other words, I could say if the price goes up, then definitely this quantity supplied would also get increased. So ultimately it push the firm to supply as much as you can to get the maximum revenue, and vice versa. So automatically the price could get increased, the supply would get increased, so definitely the profit could get decreased. And that's a concept of the price of a commodity, or that is one of the determinant of the supply. The next concept, or you can say the next factor of supply, that is the price of related good. Producers always have a tendency to get a maximum profits for by shifting the production of one commodity to the another commodity. For an instance, that if the price of another commodity could get increased, so immediately the producer could substitute that goods to find a ways to get the more profitable, so that by producing that particular commodity, it could reduce its production of the existing commodity, you can say commodity, or you can it could decrease the production of another commodity to get the maximum profit by from the production of a first commodity or a one commodity, and that's called the price of related good. It means there is a substitution effect. That means the producer can easily substitute the another commodity for one commodity to gain the maximum profits by utilizing, or to produce that commodity by reducing or by substituting the production of the another commodity. So that's called the price of related goods. So we can talk about here the positive relationship as exists in case of the positive related good. Suppose the seller Suppose the seller of tea noticed that, oh, if the price of a coffee would get increased, so ultimately he could immediately took a step that automatically just reduce the amount of resources so that the selling of tea or the supply of the tea would get increased in favor of a coffee. So that's the perfect example of a price of related goods. So automatically, if something that a seller would like to reduce any of the good prices, so automatically he could push the amount of the resources where the supply of another commodity would get increased in favor of the coffee. The next concept is the number of firms. So automatically when we talk about the firms, we always talk about the market supply. So automatically when we talk about the market supply of a particular product, it always depends on how much the number of firms available in the market. So if there are a number of firms are available or there is an increase in the number of firms, so automatically the market supply of a commodity would get increased and vice versa. So automatically if there is less number of firms, so automatically the supply of that particular commodity would get also decreased. So next we talk about the goal of the firm. So automatically that every firm has a ultimate goal that to maximize the profits. That means just to increase the commodity at a particular higher prices, and that's the ultimate goal of the firm to get the maximum revenue or the profits. When we talk about on the opposite side, if we could see if the goal of the firm is to maximize the sale, that means the more quantity to be supplied at the same price to get the maximum profits, or to increase the maximum to maximum sales of that particular product. That's called the goal of the firm. So there are two parameters. So if the particular firm goal is to maximize profits, the more quantities to be supplied with a higher price. So on other hand, we could say if to maximize sales, so at the same price, the supply would be possible and or would get increased at the same price only. As a result, it would increase the sale of that particular product. The next concept is the price of the factor of production. So factors of production, there are 4 or 5 factors of production. So if any of the supply, that means the supply of a commodity, it automatically dependent on the prices of the factors of production. That means that the price of the factors of production will ultimately influence the supply of a particular commodity. Let's say if the factor prices or the factors prices of particular of the production like land, labor, capital would get increased, so automatically their production, their cost of production would also get reduced. As a result, the more quantities supplied of a commodity will be there at its existing price at the same price, I could say. So if the factor prices would get increased, the cost of production would get also increased. In such a situation, the quantity supplied of a commodity would become less at the same price. So automatically, it to conclude this determinant, it is a positive relationship between the factor prices and the production of a particular commodity. So if the factor prices would get increased, the production would get increased. In such situation, the less and less commodity supplied at the same price. So it would get decreased, the more and more quantity supplied at the same price. So this it automatically influenced, or you can see a direct relationship between the factor prices and its cost of production. And ultimately, the outcome is the more and less of the commodity will be supplied at the same price. So then the next concept is the change in technology. Automatically, any changes in the technology automatically affect the supply of a commodity. Either it would be improvement in the technology, whether it would be advancement of the technology, whether it would be you can say any improvement in the technique of the production would automatically reduce the cost of production. If the cost of production would get reduced, it means the more and more quantity will be supplied at the existing price or at the same price. That's called the change in technology. So automatically, if we talk about the traditional laptops, or now we talk about the modern computers, or you can see the mobile phones, so automatically the more and more supply of that particular commodity would get increased at this existing price or the same price which was sold earlier. So that's called the change in technology. The next determinant is the expected future price. So automatically, if a particular seller expect that there is a fall or there is a reduction in the price of a commodity, so automatically the current supply would increase, because it is a prediction or it is an expectation about the changes in the price level in the future. So any expectations would get increase or decrease in the near future, and accordingly, the current supply of that particular commodity would get reduced or increased. So it totally depend upon the expectation of the changes in the prices in the near future, and accordingly, the current supply of the commodity would get changed. As a result, the supply would also get influenced by the prediction about the future prices of a particular commodity. So you can see in the image. So if the particular price or a seller is expected to there is to expect an increment in the price, then at the presently the current scenario, the current supply of a commodity would get reduce. Automatically, there is an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity supplied, just because of a expectation about the future price of a particular commodity. So when we talk about the government policy, we always talk about the major taxation and subsidy policy of the government. And automatically, when we talk about government, always we are not talking about the individual supply. We always talk about the market supply of a commodity. So if there is any increases or any increment or any increase in the taxation, so automatically it would reduce the supply. If the taxes would goes up, then automatically nobody could able to supply as more as the seller has expected, because the taxes are very on very high or at a high rate, I could say. So on the other hand, they will just focus on the subsidies, where the supply of a commodity would get increased. So there is an inverse relationship when we talk about the taxes and the supply, but when we talk about the subsidies or subsidy or subsidize, so that means it also increase the supply of a commodity. So automatically, either it would direct or indirectly it influence the supply of a particular commodity in a given market. Now the concept is law of supply. What is law of supply? There is a rule where the supply stands for. The rule states that other things would remain the same. That means the all the factors which has been explained earlier would remains constant. Only there is a change in the price and supply. That means if any quantity of any commodity that the firm is willing to produce and offer for sale, it could get changed, either increase or decrease just according to the price of that particular commodity, or according with the change in the prices of that particular commodity during a particular period of time. That's called the law of supply. Law of supply states that all other determinants which influence the supply would get constant. Only the price of a commodity would get influenced, or would influence the supply of a commodity. That's called the law of supply. For example, if a particular seller or a producer would increase the price, then automatically the quantity supply would get increased, or vice versa. So if we talk about the other, all factors would be technology, government policy, goals of the farm, price, the related goods will not be changed. That means all other factors would get remains or would get constant or remains constant. Only the price and quantity supplied would have a direct relationship between, or positive relationship between each another, and that's called the law of supply. So this is the graphical representation of the laws supplied. And how do you represent the diagram of a market? You can see the tabular representation of the price and the quantity supply, and the graphical representation. Uh, the law supply in this particular representation always shows a positive relationship, and accordingly you have to portray the price on the y-axis and the quantity supplied on the x-axis, and accordingly based on the data you have to mark, you can say, in the particular graph. That means if we talk about the x-axis, you just mark upon the quantity supplied. It would be reached to 5 to 11. So the lowest is 5 and the highest is 11. Just take a gap of 2 to like 0 to 2, 4, then 6 or 8 or 10, or you can say a one difference, 8, 9, yeah, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Just accordingly the difference should be this smaller. It would, according to the data, it would be difference in the quantity when you graphical represent the data. So when we talk about the prices you can take up 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, or 1 difference. So that is totally acceptable. But you cannot take the more and more differences while graphing, or while showing a graphical representation in the examination. So take a smaller gap so that accordingly you can represent the data based the schedule which has been designed accordingly. So when we talk about the law of supply, as I told, the law of supply stands a positive or direct relationship between the quantity supplied and the price, and other factors would remains constant. And that's a rule. That's a law of supply, that other determinants which also influence the supply would remains constant, but a positive relationship would exist between the supply quantity of a particular commodity. So if we talk about the diagram, so there is the particular graphical representation states that the supply curve will slope downwards, slope upwards from left to right, which also shows a positive or a functional relationship, which that represent that as the price increases, the quantity supply would also increase, and that's called law of supply. So there is a few assumptions to apply while you apply the concept of the supply. So there is no change in the price, there is no change in technique of production, there is no change in any goal of the firm, no change in any of the prices, the related goods, and the producer will never expect to change in the price of a commodity in the near future, or you never expect the future price in a particular market, and that's called the assumptions, where the law states that none of the factors would get changed, and that's become the assumptions of the law of supply. there is an exceptions to the law of supply. So there is a few parameters, a few key points where the law of supply is doesn't exist actually. So the first is the law of supply does not apply to the agricultural products. So because the supply is depends upon the natural factors. Suppose during the natural calamities, the production of wheat and rice couldn't be possible or could not reach to the market. Ultimately, the supply would get decreased. So automatically the price would be higher in the future. So as a result, there is law of supply. Such rule will not exist there in case of agricultural products. So when we talk about the next is the supply of goods having a social distinction which remains limited if the price would goes higher. So there we talk about the status goods, we talk about the standard goods where the supply of law goods will get increased or decreased where law supply doesn't exist. So that's the second parameter. And the third parameter, the seller may not be willing to sell more units of a perishable commodity at a lower price, as perishable commodities has doesn't have a longer period. It's a very short period. So as a result, it is very difficult to sell such products at a lower price. Whatever the price has been fixed by the seller, having lower the price, that means the law supply is doesn't exist. So these are the three exceptions which has been you can see shown on the screen. So now the next question arises, why the more and more good is sold when its price increases, and why does the supply curve slopes upwards? So what are the reasons behind it? So these are the main reasons actually. There is a begin under this, the answer of this question is derived from the two concepts. The first one is contraction or the extension of supply or the movements along the supply curve, or in other words, a shifts of the supply curve. So why does the supply curve slopes upwards? So there is a positive relationship of you can say between the price and the quantity supply, and as a result, if there is if even higher the price, the seller is free to sell their product even at the higher price in the market, and other particular factors would remains constant. Opposing second concept, why it slopes upward, because it's a positive relationship between the quantity supplied and the price. That means a positive slope also states that there is also an increase in the cost of production. If there is an increase in the cost of production, more and more in quantity will be supplied at a higher price, and that's called the that's the main reason that the supply curve slopes upwards. When we talk about the last particular note, but why it slopes upwards, that means the rise in the price also motivates the producers or the sellers to produce that the same commodity at a higher price to gain the maximum to maximum or a higher profits, and that's the three main reasons that the supply curve slopes upwards. So now if we talk about the change in the new concept, that is change in quantity supplied or extension or contraction of supply or movements along the supply curve. There is a graphical representation has been shown over here that any increase in the quantity supplied of a commodity just due to or just because of an increase in the price, that's called extension. If you see the arrow of the upward, there is a central key point where the price and the quantity has been decided. So if there is an increase in the price, it called you can see extension. If there is a decrease in the price, it's called contraction. And just because of the increase and decrease of the prices, ultimately the quantity supplied, if there is an increase in the price, there the quantity supplied, if you see the upward sloping curve, if there is an upward slope, there is a upward arrow of an upward slope, it refers to an extension in supply. Why it's called extension? Because the quantity and the price has increased. But when we talk about the contraction, the price and the quantity has decreased, which you can see in the downwards arrow, or you can say the backward arrow of the quantity and downward arrow of a price fall. And on when we talk about the upward sloping curve, there is a downward, you can see backward arrow, which stands for the contraction in supply. So it's very simple, it's very you can say explain in a simple manner that there is a direct relationship between the you can see quantity supplied and the price of a commodity. So if there is an increase in both, we call extension of a supply, and there is a decrease in both, we talk in a contraction of supply. So you can see in the diagram as well, there is a increment in the shape of the slope of a upward curve. We talk about the extension in supply. If there is a downward slope, we talk about the contraction in supply. So that is the conceptual framework of the contraction or the extension of supply. So there is a next concept, that is a change in supply or an increase or decrease in the supply or a shift in supply curve. Both have the same meaning. So when we talk about the supply, so if we talk about the rightward of the supply curve, we talk about the increase in supply. When we talk about the leftward of the supply curve, we talk about the decrease in supply. The price would remain constant when any, or you can say the quantity supplied would be sold at the existing price only, and that price P stands for the existing price. Only the quantity would get increase or decrease. So if there is an increase in the quantity supplied at the existing price, we talk about the increase in supply. If you can see the diagram, if there is an increase in the quantity supplied at the existing price, there is a rightward shift of the supply curve. If there is a decrease in the quantity supply of a commodity, it shows there is a leftward of the supply curve. It states that there is a decrease in supply. Or if you talk about the leftward shift, we can also talk about, in other words, the backward shift, right? So that's called the decrease in supply. So this is a conceptual framework, whether it could state a change in supply or increase or decrease in supply or a shifts in supply curve. And this is all about this concept. It shifts in supply curve, left and rightward, you can say backward shift or upward shift. So this is all about it. So the next concept is elasticity of demand. We always talk about when there is a changes in supply due to the prices or other factors. We just get to know that what are the changes involved in the particular quantity supplied relevant to its price. But when we talk about the elasticity, it shows that how much the percentage change in quantity just due to the percentage change in the particular price. That means it refers to its rate of the responsiveness, that how frequently the changes in the supply just due to the changes in the price. And there is a tool which a seller or a particular researcher can measure its response of its quantity supply due to the change in the prices. That tool is called elasticity. So that is called the elasticity of supply, which is one of the most important concept and very easy to understand the concept, as well as the mathematical equations and of course its methods, and what are the factors which influence such elasticity of supply. So let's begin with elasticity of supply. So as I already told that law of supply, so law of supply rule will also exist in the elasticity of supply. It means how much the supply which will increase in response to the increase in price cannot be known from the law of supply. So we cannot exactly measure that on what ratio the supply would get increased or decreased just due to the prices, so that the law of supply does not reflect that. But when we apply the elasticity of supply, which measures that how much the quantity supply would get changed according to the price level, or there is a change in the price level of a particular commodity, the elasticity of supply, the concept of elasticity of supply will apply when we talk about the measurements of the supply in response to any of the changes in the price. But when we talk about the law of supply just denote a positive relationship, and other factors would get remains constant. But elasticity of supply, the other factors will also be considered which influence that supply. How much the supply would get influenced by these factors, that is the technology, government policy, that will be measured through the elasticity of supply. So this is all about this concept. Mathematically, I could say it refers or is defined as a percentage change in the quantity demanded by the percentage change in its price. That means whatever the formula has been shown mathematically, just express the same formula into the words. So it's very easy to explain elasticity of demand if a particular learner would might forget during the examination or might forget the concept that how to express it into the words. So this is a mathematical equation, that is a percentage change in quantity supplied by percentage change in price. Just express the same into the words. That's called elasticity of supply. So mathematically, that is delta Q. Delta Q means that Q2 minus Q1 by Q. Q stands for quantity supplied of a last unit, and Q delta Q is a difference of the quantity supplied of a next unit and quantity supplied of the last unit. So whatever the difference between these two quantities supplied, that's called the delta supply, delta Q. But when we talk about the delta P, that is the difference between the price level of the next unit and the price level of the last unit. That's the difference of these two, that's called delta P. And P stands for the price of a last unit. Q is a quantity supplied of a last unit. So that stands for delta Q by delta. In other words, we can say delta Q by Q divide by delta P by P. So the exact formula comes as delta Q by delta P into P by Q. So this is the main formula we derive from an equation of the form for mathematical formula, that is delta Q by delta P into P by Q. So this is another formula mathematically to measure the elasticity of supply. The next is types of elasticity of supply. So these are the types: elastic supply, inelastic supply, unitary elastic, perfectly elastic, and perfectly inelastic. So when we talk about the perfectly elastic supply, it's infinity. The price would remains the constant, but quantity supplies are infinite. That means either the quantity supply infinite or nothing will be supplied, and that's called the perfectly elastic supply. So that means the whatever the interpretation of the diagram stands for, that unlimited quantity will be offered for sale at a particular price, that is OP. So if any prices drops or below the constant price, if the price would get falls, nothing will be supplied. That means there is no supply, quantity supply will be produced. The next one is perfectly inelastic supply, that means it's equal to zero. So when we talk about vertical shape, that means the quantity supply would remains unchanged, whether there is any change in the price, whether increase or decrease, quantity will remains constant, will not be increase or decrease at all. Whether, let's say, if we consider the supply curve of land in terms of country or the world as a whole, that means the supply curve would remains, quantity supplied would remains constant even if there is a changes in the price, whether increase or decrease, the quantity supplied will remains constant, it cannot be changed at all. And that's the main reason the elasticity of supply, the type of the elasticity of supply would be perfectly inelastic supply, which is equal to zero. So when we talk about the unitary elasticity of supply, which is called equal to 1. So whether if any changes in the price and quantity supplied by the same magnitude, that means in this the any change in the price or any change in the quantity by the same proportion, that's called unitary elasticity of supply. You can see in the diagram whether their price will go up or quantity will go up as well, but in the same proportion. The difference between these two increment in the price and quantity would remains the difference of these two with the same proportion. That's called the unitary elasticity of supply. So you can easily understand with the help of the diagram about what was the exact meaning of the unitary elastic. So it is very simple from the diagram to understand. If there is any change in the price and any change in the quantity by the same proportion, that's called unitary elasticity of supply, which is equal to 1. The next one is relatively elastic supply, where the which is more than 1. That means the elasticity of supply is more than 1. That means the quantity supplied would be increased. That means any change in the price and the quantity supplied would differs. That means if there is an increase, if there is an increase or and if there is an increase in the price and increase in the quantity supplied by a different proportion, by a larger proportion, it's called relatively elastic supply, which is more than 1. So it depends. The larger the quantity supplied would having the larger magnitude than the increase in the price. That's called relatively elastic demand as well. Next concept is relatively inelastic. Supply, not demand. Relatively inelastic supply, which is less than 1. That means the quantity supplied would get reduced due to a larger increase in the prices of the commodity. So the supply would call inelastic when there is a change in the price, would get a larger change in the price which cause a small change in the quantity supplied. That's called relatively inelastic supply, which is less than 1. Less than 1 means the quantity supplied would be lesser than the increase in the supply prices of a particular commodity. That's called the relatively inelastic supply. The next one is how to measure the price elasticity of supply. So one of the main type of the elasticity of supply. So there's the same meaning is defined as a proportionate change in the particular particular quantity demanded by a percentage change in its price, and that's called the price elasticity of demand. As there is, if there is any change in the price of a quantity demanded just due to the change in its price, and that's called the price elasticity of demand, where the quantity supplied of a commodity and the price would have a functional or positive relationship between each and other. Basically, there are two main methods to measure the price elasticity of supply, that is a percentage method and geometric method. This is a percentage method, like there is a percentage change, or you can say percentage proportionate change in quantity demanded by a proportionate change, quantity supplied by a proportionate change in its price. That's called the percentage method to measure the elasticity of supply. So it's very common method while measuring the you can say elasticity of supply, that is price elasticity of supply, which is a very similar concept or relate to the elasticity of demand. This method is also called the proportionate method as well. And elasticity of supply is measured as a ratio of the percentage change in quantity demanded by a percentage change in its price. So this is the percentage method. And the mathematical, the example has been shown. A particular producer offers to sell 400 units of a commodity when its price is 100 per unit, while only 200 units are offered if the price reduces to 5 per unit. Find the elasticity of demand. So if you have a formula that is a percentage change in quantity demanded by a percentage change in its price, so if you could see the 200 units by 5 into 10 by 400. So that's the elasticity of supply. The price elasticity of supply is equal to 1. If you can look upon it into the formula, that is percentage change in quantity demanded, that is the 200 units, and the reduced price is 5. So 200 by 5 into 10 by 40, or in other words, you can see a percentage change in quantity demanded. So what was the difference is 200. What was the, you can say, difference, that is 5. So if you look at the differences, you can easily apply the values into the formula, and you can estimate the you can say elasticity of supply, which is equal to 1. The second concept is geometric method. This method is used in 5 situations of elasticity of supply, so which is shown over here. Elasticity of supply is equal to 1 is unitary elasticity of supply, where the particular shape will begin from the origin. So that's called the unitary elasticity, where the particular supply curve begin from the origin. That's called the unitary elasticity. So when we talk about the more than one or greater than one or greater unitary elastic, it's begin from the y-axis. And geometry method states that how these shapes would begin, how these shapes would you can say start from in the particular graphical representation from the origin as well as y-axis. So when we talk about less than, it begins from the x-axis. When we talk about perfectly inelastic, it begins where the you can say vertical shape, where the price would get up, increase or decrease. So when we talk about perfectly elastic, where it is in the horizontal axis, where the price would remains constant and the quantity demanded would get increased. That's called the perfectly elastic supply. So these are the factors which influence the elasticity of demand, elasticity of supply, nature of inputs used, natural constraints or factors like natural calamities, then risk-taking nature of the commodity, time factor, and that's it for today. So these are the factors which also influence the elasticity nature of inputs used. So it depends that how what type of products would be used, what type of factors to be used or reductions. Then accordingly, it would the supply would can be measured whether elastic or inelastic. Natural calamities, whether it influenced by the natural factors, and accordingly the cost of production would get changed. So that's it for today, which has been shown. In the upcoming session, we'll begin with some more interesting and important topics. Thank you to all and namaste to all.